My name is Liana Sananda Giluli. I currently work as MAPS's Development Officer, and I'm also the board chair and founder of the North Star Project, where we have gone to work with hundreds of stakeholders across the field of psychedelics to develop a set of principles to encourage that anyone who might be starting a new endeavor in the field of psychedelics is grounded in psychedelic wisdom. And so the principles that we've set out at North Star are really helping us to define how to show up in this field to ensure that we are not just practicing business as usual, but that we are embodying all of the important wisdom and knowledge, and ensuring that we are prioritizing public benefit over everything else. So before I introduce our speaker today, Joseph, I'd love to just share a little bit about the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, which you will be learning about in this next session. This initiative has been under development by Chacruna for close to a year now, and it is a very important project, and I serve as an advisor to this project. Our speaker, Joseph Mays, has been spearheading this effort, yet before I hand the stage over to him, I'd like to acknowledge a few things. We are at the very beginning of the commercial development of the field of psychedelics. In this moment, it is our opportunity and our obligation to the medicines and to the peoples who hold the biocultural knowledge that this field has benefited tremendously from, to determine how we will define this emergent field moving forward. How we show up to this responsibility now will determine the shape that this field takes in the future. It is with this in mind that Chacruna went out to companies and philanthropists and asked for support in the creation of this project. And we are so grateful that Synthesis Institute and Numinous supported our efforts to develop this initiative in South and Central America, and the Nikkei Foundation supported us in North America. Yesterday, in a pre-launch meeting we hosted with a group of entrepreneurs, investors, and philanthropists involved in some of the largest psychedelic companies that are forming now, we made the invitation to the very people who stand to financially gain from their activities in this field to make a meaningful step with us towards setting the precedent that actors in this field will directly engage with thoughtful acts of reciprocity towards the Indigenous communities who have given us so very much. And I'd like to thank the following organizations and companies for taking the stand with us and donating a total of $54,000 to the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative yesterday. Lucy Scientific joined us as a founding member at $25,000. Dr. Bronner's, River Styx, Oren Fund, Fearless Ventures, Maya Health, Synergia Alliance, Fourth Road Health, Clark Howell LLP, McAllister Garfield PC, Circadian Lab, and Speak AI all joined us as contributors. The members of these organizations and companies have said yes to acknowledging all that we owe to Indigenous peoples. This is a very first step on a much longer journey that we are all taking together as we continue to define the principles and the values that we will embody in this field for years to come. If you represent an organization or an individual that is looking to support this work, I would like to invite you to reach out to us at iri@chacruna.net for more information. There's also a link that you can find on our website, chacruna.net, with more information and with a way to donate. So with all of that said, it is my honor to introduce you to the person who's been spearheading these efforts, Joseph Mays. And one thing I'll say before I bring him up is that I'll be hanging out after. We'll have, he'll give a presentation, and then towards the end, we'll have 20 to 25 minutes to do questions. And so please be sure to add your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. And I will be calling them out for Joseph to answer at the end of his presentation. So a little bit more about Joseph. Joseph Mays earned his Master of Science in Ethnobotany from the University of Kent upon researching responses to globalization by Indigenous Yanisha of Central Peru. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in biology and anthropology from Virginia Commonwealth University, he traveled to the Ecuadorian, completed an ethnobotanical survey of Camarones, and published a medical plant guide for the Yamacoac Ecological Reserve. He studies the relationship between biological and cultural diversity and the way culturally conditioned views of reality influence approaches to the environment. So I'd like to now invite Joseph Mays up to share more about the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. Joseph, to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Liana, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. My name is Joseph Mays, and I'm just so grateful for this weekend. I hope that this time we all have together might bring us some healing, and that we might bring healing to others. And I'm just gonna pull up my slides real quick. So before I get started, I just want to dedicate this talk to Don Ricardo, who passed away sadly 2 weeks ago. Ricardo Fray Potesta was an elder in the Yanesha community of Sachopen, and his friendship was an incredible gift to me during my graduate fieldwork in the Amazon. And the last time I saw Ricardo, he was hauling a giant sack of freshly harvested coffee up a steep hill in the mountains, and he really seemed indestructible. And he let me carry it the rest of the way, but I think it was more of a favor to me than it was to him. And so just want to say rest in peace, rest in power. And Ricardo's community is actually one of the groups participating in the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas, which launches today. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about. As Liana said, I've been doing ethnographic and ecological work for a decade now, and I found that these two pursuits are really one and the same. So biological and cultural conservation are inextricably linked, and it's in that spirit of biocultural conservation that I helped to create the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, or Eerie. Eerie is a resource connecting people directly with grassroots Indigenous organizations, with the goal of promoting community-led projects and addressing everything from food security to environmental health to land rights issues, economic and educational support, reforestation and agroforestry. And the thread that connects all of these different projects is that they're all self-determined by local people. They're all designed and implemented by Indigenous communities to meet their own needs and priorities, rather than something imposed from the outside. So I'm gonna come back to the resource and how it works, but first I just want to talk a little bit about the why behind Eerie. And that was really to address this question of how do we give back to Indigenous communities, which even if you're just a researcher in the field is an important question, whether you're investing in a business or not. And that was that also comes along with the consideration of what reciprocity means. What does reciprocity look like? So before we can answer those questions, we have to understand our relationship to those communities and our relationship to our own communities and our whole orientation. We have to orient ourselves properly. So that means that we have to understand what story we are in and what story do we tell and believe about ourselves, because it is that story which gives us our orientation and our identity. So the story that many of us have been given, that we are separate selves, accidentally born into a meaningless world of lifeless particles colliding in deterministic patterns, this is not really a sustainable point of view, and it's not even scientific, although it sounds like it. And Don Ricardo and his family taught me another story that we are invited to enter. And this is one where life is always communicating with us, and our well-being is intimately connected to that of every other human being, every organism, and every organ of the planet. So what can we learn from Indigenous stories, or stories of relationship that are so profoundly different from the story of alienation established in the shadow of colonialism, capitalism, and modernity? What story or ontology or cosmology are we all unconsciously operating under? And the answer to that question is what really determines the nature of all our relationships. Because reciprocity can only take place within a system of relationship. So a system of relationship between beings who recognize each other as subjects with agency. How we see ourselves and how we see others, not only other human beings, but also other organisms, trees, forests, fungi, animals, rivers, even organic compounds, and as well as how they see us makes all the difference. And for example, the Avila Runa in the Ecuadorian Amazon say that when you're camping in the forest, you should always sleep face up, because if a were-jaguar happens upon you in the night and they see a face looking back at them, they will recognize you as a subject, as a person who is capable of looking back, a self like themselves, and they'll leave you alone. So for the Runa, how other kinds of beings see us is important. And the fact that other kinds of beings see us challenges the division between nature and culture that we're conditioned to accept by the dominant story or the dominant forms of thinking, the dominant ontology that we live in. And if we're forced to recognize the fact that seeing and representing and knowing are not exclusive to humans, that story kind of falls apart. So this all points to that connection between our relationship to nature and the world, and then how it impacts ideas of conservation and reciprocity. And I'm sure many of you can agree that the perspective shifting value of psychedelic plants, part of that is the stories and the ontologies informed by them. They question that nature-culture dichotomy, and instead of treating the environment as a network of subjective selves with agency, that is what they invite us to do. And so as in many indigenous ontologies, as in that story of the jaguar, all living beings are seen as persons or subjects with agency. The vulture sees the maggots in a rotting carcass the exact same way that we view a river full of salmon. And the peccaries see their salt lick as a community feasting hall. And even the forest itself can be thought of as a thinking being, or a network of selves with their own thoughts, with whom we're in constant communication. So that same Western scientific perspective, reaping the benefits of ethnopharmacological discoveries generated by indigenous people, also dismisses this indigenous perspective. And this contradiction is what results in, or it's part of what results in the degradation of forests and communities by those same forces that profit from them. So leaving behind that nature and culture dichotomy and engaging with a story that views forests as living networks and all other beings as subjects with their own minds and agency is really a psychedelic point of view. And it strengthens indigenous autonomy, and it ensures the protection of valuable resources of biocultural diversity and ecological knowledge. And that's what allows the seeds of reciprocity to take root. So the first time I interviewed Don Ricardo, he invited me here to his office, which was this patch of dirt next to his herb garden and his chili pepper field. And I remember he brought out some wooden stools that he had built decades ago, and we sat under the shade of some tall ocumanos or podocarpus trees and this was what he called his designated interview area. And it was across the road from a stand of avocado trees where we harvested fruit the day before. And he was always teasing me and joking with me. He used to say he'd charge me 100 soles per hour for interviews. But in reality, Ricardo never asked me for money, and neither did anyone else. Although I was told many times by people in Lima, all Indians will ask you for money. They're all like that. This wasn't the case. And at one point during our conversation, we were deep in conversation, and then we were interrupted by a chorus of citizen birds singing in the branches above us. And Ricardo immediately paused and pointed it out. And he said that, listen to the little parrots. It's not always like this. It's not so common. It means you're a good people, or this is a good moment. And he said they only sing that way sometimes, and you don't see them around so much. And at his age, at 73, Ricardo probably remembers when that bird song was much more common. But over the decades, he lived through the valley's deforestation, religious persecution from Franciscan missionaries, displacement from colonos. But he always welcomed me with open arms, and whether he was harvesting coffee or he was in his garden or his office, he was always listening. And he was always in communication with the forest, which is speaking to us whether we're listening or not, or whether we hear it or not. So this is Ricardo's son-in-law, Eduardo, and Ricardo and Eduardo and many others have medicinal plants in their home gardens. And Eduardo was also starting a nursery for lost varieties of food and medicine plants. And he also leads traditional dances. So one of the most popular is all about the entheogenic brew, ayahuasca. The lyrics describe a time when all Yanesha were sick and dying, so they had to take ayahuasca in order to transform into a giant snake and be cured. And when they perform it, everyone sings along and dances, and even though they might not know the meaning of all the Yanesha words anymore. And this is despite the fact that in Sachopen there are no living shamans or curanderos. They don't take ayahuasca. But Eduardo knows that it's attracting tourists and attention elsewhere in Amazonia, and he would recommend I go visit the Matsugenka, who he called his brothers, if I wanted good medicine. And he did warn me that you shouldn't take ayahuasca to see visions, that this will only cause death and madness. You take it only as a medicine. So the first time I saw Eduardo perform this dance about ayahuasca, he was leading everyone in this ceremonial dress with the parrot feathers and the seed and shell bandoliers, painting with achiote, face paint, and shaking shakers, playing tambores. And I remember being completely hypnotized by their chanting and singing and their synchronized dance patterns. And at one point, I was about to fall into a trance, and Eduardo kind of snapped me out of it at just the right moment. He encouraged everyone to clap along. And I can still feel that grounding, that orienting sensation of bringing my hands together, transforming from an observer into a participant, and shifting from a perspective of abstraction and alienation into one of communication and relationship. So Western biomedicine, of course, recognizes and exploits indigenous medicinal knowledge while denying their stories and their ontological perspective, even as environmental science has begun to recognize the ecological value of indigenous land management practices and the importance of indigenous territory in preserving healthy forests. Popular publications are introducing people to the idea of plant intelligence, but all of this hasn't really seemed to change the story that's so deeply embedded in our dominant culture and that informs our political, social, and economic lives. The Yanesha, along with Indigenous people around the world have to steer carefully with an awareness of the possible machinations of conservation narratives and so-called sustainable development. But when we examine what brought about this hazardous situation where the global market economy relentlessly reduces their choices, it really seems clear that the best case scenario is one where Indigenous communities achieve both more autonomy and less pressure, and where their agency is what is supported. So there is a very real danger in expecting Indigenous peoples to provide the solutions to the ecological crises created by the global north while simultaneously bearing the brunt of the consequences. And it's important to remember that neither the Yanesha nor any other Indigenous group is a monolith that's unchanging. And so supporting the agency and autonomy of Indigenous peoples is part of stepping out of this atrophied ontology, of this story that transforms relations into things and perceives life as a collection of detached objects. Instead, it reminds us to orient ourselves in this network of interrelationship and cooperation that demands our participation. So it is with this in mind that we created the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. And this resource is a curated list of 30 organizations from South, Central, and North America. It's broken down by region with descriptions giving a glimpse into each project and a link to their websites, their donation pages. And the Eerie resource is really meant to raise awareness about those local initiatives and facilitate direct support from Chacruna's audience. And avoiding intermediaries, allowing individuals to directly support and donate to each Indigenous organization. So the emphasis is on small scale, Indigenous centered and community driven projects. To accompany this resource, we are also launching the Eerie Program, which is what is encouraging investment into Indigenous communities from large donors. And it creates a unified pathway to support all of the grassroots Indigenous organizations involved by donating to a pool that is evenly distributed. But in order to keep this resource open, we still feel it's important to allow for unmediated support. So everyone is still able to just donate directly to an initiative of their choice by using the resource. And the resource is launching today. You can go there and you can learn more about the criteria for how we chose organizations and what that process was like, because this is really the product of working directly with Indigenous leaders and organizers that support the autonomy of local people above all else. So each organization is targeted to a specific group of local communities. Each one is operated by members of the communities being supported. They're all locally designed and implemented. The majority of the organizations deal directly with one group. The majority are completely Indigenous run, and 9 out of the 30 are led by Indigenous women and focus on women's issues primarily. And even those nonprofits which are based externally or helmed by non-Indigenous organizers are run by Indigenous leaders and directed by community consensus at the local level. So the project is kind of framed around long-term sustainable strategies rather than short-term relief efforts. And it's really important that Eerie is a living, breathing network that creates a support network for all these grassroots groups. And it was important to stress relationships to the land, irrespective of psychoactive plant use. So we wanted to include Indigenous groups that are left out of the conversation in psychedelic circles or tourism. And the community-centered nature of Eerie's projects, it focuses on collective efforts and avoids concentrating funds into the hands of one or two well-connected families or shamans. And it has a structure that avoids intermediaries. It invites a deeper consideration into what is meant by the idea of reciprocity. So how we might embody that understanding, and hopefully contributes to a general cultural and awareness around reciprocity within our communities. And, reciprocity is something that's often vaguely defined. It's paid lip service by corporate interests, or it's used to launder the promises of development, of access and benefit sharing, or it's a concept that doesn't neatly fit into this model of capitalist exploitation that's extracting profits from indigenous cultures. And the Quechua term Aini, which is often translated as reciprocity, refers to a society existing in a constant state of flux. So a perpetually reordering and correcting for the dynamic imbalance of every living moment in the pursuit of collective well-being. And so I just want to close with saying that this legacy of monumental injustices left by colonialism and biological piracy is something that can never be properly righted or adequately repaid by the same systems that now profit from indigenous knowledge. So reciprocity can get conflated with equality or quid pro quo exchange, but it's really more than give and take. It's a constant process of balancing that acknowledges our place in an ever-shifting story of relationship. So Eerie provides a unique avenue for psychedelic enthusiasts to reciprocate with their environment, with its indigenous defenders, but it is also meant to be a bridge that builds lasting relationships in this living and growing network. And it also helps facilitate communication between these groups that allows them to support each other in solidarity and exchange ideas about how to tackle the similar challenges that they face. So this program and this resource will run continuously with the possibility of renewal and inclusion of new participants in 1 year. And you can keep up to date with Eerie and with the different groups in Eerie through our social media series, which every Thursday we post and we highlight a different organization each week. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and close, and thank you all so much for being here and listening.
Joseph, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I can just feel the heart and connection that you have and that you've been able to cultivate during your experiences. And I'm just really grateful. The list is extraordinary. We'll go ahead and drop the link into the chat so people can view the different groups that have been selected. And as Joseph mentioned, this is currently set up as a 1-year pilot. And so we're going to run the program, see how it goes, and see where we can go from here, and see if we can't start, this is really a seed for all of us to start building this community and connection and relationship that Joseph was just so beautifully speaking to. So there are a few questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start off with a question from Keith Williams. He said, in case I missed it, to what extent does this initiative draw on the indigenous concepts of the gift, drawing on thinkers like Kimmerer, Rauna Kukkonen, and others?
Well, Kimmerer is actually a huge inspiration for me. I've just been rereading Braiding Sweetgrass, and so it completely resonates with me and my sort of thinking that goes into how I approach indigenous cultures and how I approach conservation. I think that I would be hesitant to make a blanket definition of an indigenous concept of the gift. I think sometimes that idea is a little bit appropriated by non-Indigenous people, and I am really interested in what Indigenous perspectives are on that. So that's who I would defer to for that question. But I certainly pay attention as much as I can to the language that's used and how to best be respectful of where those concepts originate. So that's I think that's sort of answers that question, but thank you.
Anything you could add for those of us who might not be familiar with the work of Kimmerer on what his concept of the gift is?
Oh, well, Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's Anishinaabe woman, and she's also an ecologist. And the idea of the gift, I think that the question is referring to is really, I kind of talked about it a little bit in the presentation, but the story of creation is one where we've been given this gift of life, and we are supported by all the beings around us. And so it is really our obligation to return the gift, and that's what our lives are for. So, for me, that really just means that every moment is a time where I'm thinking about what am I giving, and how can I give my energy to support life and to support the people that are around me and the organisms that are around me and the other beings that are less obvious. And so that's kind of how I approach it, but I can't really speak for everyone, only for myself. But
thank you so much for sharing that beautiful concept. The next question I will ask is from somebody on the Chacruna team on tech support, Anthony Party. What are the most effective ways in which North Americans can aid in the protection and sustainable accessibility to education and experience of sacred plant medicines in South America and globally?
So I think whenever that question comes up about like what is the best way that North Americans or Europeans or people that are from the global north can support Indigenous people, I think, I just always come back to the question of what they're asking for, what their priorities are, and what have they determined that their needs are, and what strategies have they decided that they want to use. So there's definitely kind of a danger and a tendency for large organizations and large NGOs to impose models on Indigenous people. And so that's kind of something that I really want to avoid supporting. So that's why this initiative is kind of, as much as possible, directly targeted to those initiatives that are community driven and community led. So, I think that in your own personal life, it's whatever your gifts are, whatever your position is, that's where you are in this system of relationship, and that's that answer is going to be different for everyone depending on where they are. So you can start with yourself and with your community around you and the patch of land that you live on. But if you do your best to sort of live those principles in your own life, I think in some ways that's better than trying to save somebody else. But if you can find ways to support them through something like Eerie, I think that's a good step that you can take. And just being conscious of your own actions and how what you're doing and how you're moving through the world is affecting others. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a really great answer, starting with inside and starting with where we are currently. There's a question in here about how else people might be able to reciprocate with anything besides money. So how can somebody offer or donate labor or work through this initiative?
That's a great question. So if you visit any of these organizations' websites, there's usually a contact, and often there's a call for volunteers. They always need help, support with technical issues with promotion or with just running business and all of those, everything that goes into having an online presence. And there's always volunteer positions, and so I think if you're really interested in that, there's always an opportunity to dedicate your time and energy to something that you want to support, and it doesn't mean that you have to donate money. So I think, yeah, if you look into any of those organizations, you can find a way.
Great. Yeah. And I'll also mention here that the listing of organizations on Eerie, each organization, there's a link to their website, and you can also give directly to each of the organizations, or you can give to the general pool of funds that then will be equally dispersed throughout all the organizations. So there's a way to, if any of the organizations are interesting to you, there's a way to reach out directly and connect and directly support as well. I'm wondering if you can also speak to the urge. I think that many of us, I'm currently in the city of Oakland, and I think many people who exist in cities have an urge to more directly connect and engage with these communities, and possibly even visit them. And I'm wondering if you might speak to that, of how, to best approach that, or maybe not, or.
Yeah, I think that kind of in the last question touched on it a little bit. So, if I was talking to my younger self, I might encourage Joe to focus on the land around him and learning what the indigenous relationship to that land is and what the history of that land is, of that environment where you grew up, where you are placed, where you find yourself, the soil that you find yourself in now, and what is around you, because everywhere is a place that was indigenous, and that is land that needs to be protected and revitalized or regenerated. So that I know in cities sometimes it's more difficult, of course. Even if you just have a house plant, that's a way to connect. But community gardens are always needed. So if you don't have one, you can start one, and you can try to bring indigenous people into that. If there are, I mean, I'm sure that there are communities in most cities, in the US at least. But as far as trying to reach out to people in the global south or in countries far away, I think that, I would, of course, it's a very delicate kind of path to navigate, because the tourist economy, it's one that we all participate in when we travel, even if you try to avoid it. And those of us who have the privilege to travel, if you're doing it, I just think that it's important to do it in the most conscious way, being present and being educated about where you're going and who you're interacting with. And, ideally you're doing that with everyone wherever you are, in your own community as well. So yeah, I don't want to discourage people from doing that, but I do want to encourage people to see how they don't necessarily need to do that in order to connect or support or make changes, positive changes. So
Thank you for that answer, Joseph. I'll just share, I'm currently on unceded Ohlone territory here in Oakland, and doing things like contributing to the Sagori Land Trust on a yearly basis is important to me, to being connected into the land where I currently live. There's also a resource I'll drop in the chat. It's called native-lands.ca, and it's an interactive map where you can go ahead and view who holds the original claims to the lands, or I should say just the original acknowledgement of the lands, because there wasn't really the concept of claiming and owning land. And so I think, yeah, I think just starting there and knowing where you are standing currently right now is a really great place to start to develop that connection in with the land and the original peoples of the land that we are each living upon. So thank you so much for that. The next question is from Dr. Sandra Driesbach. Oh man, I might have butchered your name. Sorry about that. It says, I appreciate your research on narrative and the impact it can have. What story can we learn to now tell to co-create not just reciprocal relationships, but flourishing, bridging relationships?
Well, that's a beautiful question. I don't know if I can come up with an answer that's better worded than the question. I think that, you know, there are so many different stories that I wanted to tell. 25 minutes or so is surprisingly short. And my whole journey in anthropology has been mainly focused on ethnography. And so I think that it's something that has always sort of spoken to me, which is just the different views of nature, the different, like, the possibility and potential of a different conception of what humans and their environment, what relationship they have and they can have. Because I think that the story that many of us have been told is that humans can only have a negative relationship with the land, and all we can do is mitigate it and try to reduce the negativity as much as possible. But it's always going to be extractive, and we're not a part of it. We're just kind of aliens to it. So I think that if you look at Indigenous stories and you look at ethnographic material and you listen to those other conceptions of reality, that it really, you can't just decide to believe something differently than what you believe. So it takes work, and it takes practice daily of sort of stepping into a different viewpoint, and then you'll notice that it does change the way that you think and interact when you walk through a natural space. And I think I've noticed that in my own life, and just, yeah, any of those, I mean, like, it's already been brought up, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Creating Sweetgrass, is a great introduction to that idea. And I think that there's a quote from her in the book where she says that when someone becomes Indigenous, it means that they are living in a way that the health of the land and the environment is vital to their cultural and spiritual well-being, and that you treat the environment in a way that you are that your children will live on it, and their children's children, and that you want to help to support that health in the best way possible. And so yeah, and I think I noticed a comment in the chat, so I just wanted to correct myself if I misspoke. But yes, all this land is still indigenous. So of course, there's saying that it used to be is definitely not what I meant. But yeah, that was a bit of a ramble. So
thank you. Great. There's a question that's now not loading, but I'll try to summarize it. Somebody was wondering what the best way to think about contributing is. How often would you recommend contributing? Should it be a percentage of somebody's income? Should it be every time somebody participates in a ceremony? What would we invite?
That's a good question. I really don't have an answer for that. I think I would be hesitant to tell people how to determine like how much to give and how often to give. I think you know, for someone with less financial resources, it's your energy and your time that you can give and your other gifts. So whether you're a storyteller or you're just by your virtue of existence and your relationships with other people, you have an effect and an impact. So those questions are really personal. I don't think I could make a prescription for everyone. I think that it depends on your situation. So yeah, I think that's really all I can say there. But
if I can add, I'll just say that give meaningfully, give a gift that means something to you. And I think that is really the foundation here of how to participate, is really think about what would be meaningful to you personally. All right, so there's a question here, which is, in your opinion, what should be the focus of the medical research being done with psychedelics to promote reciprocity?
yeah, this is a good question. I'm hoping that this conference is a place where we can try to find a good answer for that. I think that if the people behind the research have an understanding of where this resource comes from, that they are standing to benefit from, that they're investigating, I would like to see everybody have a bit of an anthropological approach to their work. So medical researchers, as well as psychedelic therapists and everybody involved in the field of medicine. And I think that the disconnect from those indigenous concepts of medicine and those that is in part what has led to the failures of our own medical system. And I'm somewhat outside of that world, so I think it's a journey that we're all on together, and I would encourage anyone that's concerned with it. To me, it's a good sign that people are asking that question. Maybe in recent years, even that question would never even come up. So the fact that it's being asked is a good thing, and we don't have a perfect answer for it right now, but that's ideally what everyone is here to try to contribute to.
Great. So we're out of time. There's 2 questions we didn't quite get to. So I'd love to know, Joseph, how can people reach out to you and stay in touch with you and ask more questions and support your work?
Well, you can keep in touch with Chacruna. I have an article on Chacruna's website, which I get into a little bit more about that story of relationship and the Yanesha who I worked with. You can find me on Instagram at Chief Low, and I also have, sorry, that's Chief and then LOW, and then I have a project called Ethnobot, which is more about plants in my area and trying to reconnect with those indigenous relationships. So I live in the Northeast in Northern Virginia in the United States, or Turtle Island, and this is what I'm spending most of my time on at the moment. So if you stay in touch with Chacruna and Eerie, you can find me. And yeah, I guess I wasn't prepared for the plug. I got to work on that.
You're great. And I'll just also add, people can email Eerie, IRI, @chacruna.net. And I would invite Felix and Keith Williams. I see both your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them today, but please reach out to us and we'll be happy to answer them. And thank you so much, Joseph, for this beautiful work that you are creating in the world. Thank you to Chacruna. Thank you to everyone who's participated in making this initiative a reality. And I hope you'll all consider joining us as we embark on this journey together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.